Hey folks, I'm William, this is Runeforged, welcome to the channel. Today we're going to be taking a look at Formoria the Dark Age, a setting book for the Shadowdark RPG. I did also want to mention that while this is not a sponsored video, the author was kind enough to send me a free preview copy of the PDF so that I could take a look at it for the channel. So a big shout out to Bryan for sending that over. As always, there will be an affiliate link down in the video description if you'd like to check this out for yourself. And just so you're aware, any purchases made after clicking on that link do help to support the channel at no additional cost to you. And I see y'all making use of those links on a regular basis, and I just want you to know that I very much do appreciate that support. Okay, so what is Formoria? Well, it's a human-centric campaign setting for Shadowdark that has echoes of a fantastical version of Dark Ages Europe, which is part of a larger campaign setting called Bestiary that also includes parts of Asia, the Middle East, and Northern Africa. And I've got a copy of Bestiary up on the screen now, if you would like to pause and take a look. And here's a better look at the zoomed in version of the map that focuses specifically on the area of Formoria, which is roughly equivalent to where, maybe France, Germany, or Spain might be in our real world. Now, I did just want to point out that there does appear to be a little bit of a glitch with this initial version of the map. As you can see, it's not perfectly lined up and there's some duplication there in the middle. So I will throw up a better version of this map on the screen so you can better get a look at some of the various different regions that are included in this campaign setting. So once again, go ahead and feel free to pause if you'd like to look at the map in greater detail. And I will talk a little bit more about the maps for this setting a little bit later in the video, but I have to say I do think this is a really gorgeous regional map for the setting. So the PDF version of this book does come in at a whopping 261 pages long, and there is a ton of stuff included in the book. And I'll just give you a quick overview of what you can expect before we do a bit of a deeper dive later in the video. So it starts off with a brief introduction to the setting before launching into some of the new character classes that you can find in the supplement. A lot of these are just kind of minor variations on already existing classes, but there are also some options for, race as class that you might see in some of the older versions of D&D. Then, of course, we do have spell lists for some of those new classes, which are a combination of some spells from the official Shadowdark rules, as well as some new additions. There's also an entire section dedicated to how this setting handles alignment. After that, there is a trove of information about the setting itself. So you've got information for languages, currency, as well as a little bit of a deeper dive into some of the various different cultures and factions that you can expect to find in the setting. And of course, you have some information on legendary NPCs and items that the players might expect to find during their travels. After that, there's about 10 pages of new monsters for the setting, as well as encounter tables for each of the various regions in the Formoria part of the world. There's also about 20 pages of history for this part of the world. And I think one of the most interesting things about this book is that a lot of the NPCs, the items, and the history is coming directly as a result of the almost 30 years of experience that the author has in running his own personal campaign in this setting. So it definitely has a very realistic and lived-in quality that I don't always see in other similar settings. The book also includes a new character sheet that incorporates the rules for alignment in the supplement, which was kind of an unexpected surprise. I was very happy to see that. And it caps off with a short, low-level adventure that you can use as an introduction to this setting. And I did want to point out that when you're not in presentation mode, the table of contents for this is hyperlinked, which I very much appreciate. If you are enjoying this video so far, please consider aiding me in my eternal struggle against the dreaded YouTube algorithm by crushing those like and subscribe buttons so you don't miss out on more exciting Shadowdark content like this in the future. Also, if you'd really like to go above and beyond, please check out the affiliate links that are linked down in the video description. Any purchases made after clicking on those links does help to support the channel at no additional cost to you. While you're down there, please consider checking out my very own Shadowdark adventure against the Cult of the Crimson Hand, which is available right now for free, technically pay what you want, on DriveThruRPG. It'll link down in the video description. Next, the author spends about 4 pages kind of giving you an introduction to the setting. I really appreciate that he lays out kind of the inspiration and base for this world as being a 4th century Dark Ages Europe. And he also goes into a little bit of detail about how this world really is built on the foundations of his own players' actions during the course of his campaign. I really like the way that it's kind of broken down here. It says the setting is not a complete Earth clone. It rhymes with rather than copies our own history. It includes the standard fantasy elements such as elves and dwarves, orcs and giants, and of course, dragons. The setting is meant to be dark, gritty, and far less high fantasy than typical modern fantasy settings, making it a natural fit for Shadowdark and other OSR systems. He also goes on to say how magic is rare and frightening, and that demi-humans are fairly rare in the setting. So again, this is a very human-centric setting, which I personally very much appreciate, but also does include sections of the world for the various different demi-human races that you might expect to see in a game like Shadowdark. Also with the inclusion of gnomes, which are stated to be mischievous, tricky, and sly. So a cool little addition on that front. Personally, I've never been a huge fan of gnomes, but I think that's typically because in a lot of fiction, they're usually portrayed as more like technologically inclined, like tinkerers, stuff like that. And that's not really something that I like to include personally in my fantasy worlds. But I think more of like the fey, mischievous, sly angle is going to be much more up my alley. On the next spread here, it does give some additional rules for how to make this feel like the setting for which it was intended. You know, talking a little bit about the core ethos, like how magic should be rare, how it should be gritty, but also there should be points of light for the characters to retreat to, you know, heal their wounds and carouse, etc. And also some additional notes on how the author suggests that you run the game. You know, there are several new classes included in Formoria. They've got a knight, ranger, seer, druid, and warlock. And the author recommends that you run these in addition to the core classes. And I did just want to point out, and the author specifies it here as well, even though these have some of the same names as some of the official Shadowdark classes, and in many ways they are similar to those classes in some respects, these are different versions from what you see in the official works. And as I alluded to earlier, there are also some race as class options. They've got elf, dwarf, halfling, and gnome. And there's also some additional information about how you can adapt some of the core classes to better fit within this particular setting. I'm not going to go through any class in any particular detail, but I will flip through some of them so it gives you a chance to see, you know, what you're working with. And I have to say, like, overall, I am pretty happy with these classes. And in several cases, even when there are like official Shadowdark versions of these various different classes, in many cases, I actually like the versions presented here a little bit more than I do the official ones. You know, for the ranger in particular, while I do like the official ranger, I found the herbalism mechanic to be a little bit clunky. And I found that a lot of the different herbalism options didn't really resonate with me. So as you can see, this version of the ranger does omit that skill, but I do think you'll see something similar pop up on the druid class, which we'll look at in just a minute. So as you can see, the druid does have the nature's gifts ability, which does look fairly similar to the ranger offering that you see in the official rules. But for whatever reason, I found these various different herbalism options to be much more in line with what I would expect. I do also appreciate that we are getting a druid class in this supplement, because I do think it is something of a blind spot in the original Shadowdark rules. I understand that I think that the neutral alignment wizard is supposed to represent kind of a druid class, and I think it does an okay job if you're willing to reskin some of the wizard spells. But personally, I really do like having druids in my campaign settings. And I do feel like a druid is a little bit different flavor-wise from your standard wizard. And I do really appreciate that this version of the druid is more of like a spellcasting flavored druid, as opposed to the more like shapeshift focused druids that you do typically tend to see in other types of RPGs. I personally find like normal shapeshifting mechanics to be kind of clunky, and I don't know how you'd be able to do that in kind of a rules light Shadowdark system in a way that I would find compelling, while also being concise and relatively rules light. The supplement also includes a warlock class, which again is this one's actually a pretty significant departure from the warlock that you see in Curse Scroll 1. And in my personal opinion, I like this version a bit better. Personally, I found it a little bit jarring when the core warlock wasn't a spellcaster in the way that I would imagine them. And I think casting them as more of a dark mirror to the priest class is much more in line with my own personal preferences. And I'll quickly page through some of the racist class options, so again, you can get a better feel for what that entails. Personally, I'm pretty neutral on racist class. On the one hand, I do kind of like that it enforces kind of a certain theme for these various different ancestries. But also I understand from a player perspective, this can feel, perhaps a little bit overly limiting. So I can personally understand why this topic is a little bit divisive. But having said that, some gorgeous black and white artwork here on this page. I'm not sure if these are meant to be gnomes or maybe dwarves. But I love this. I love that the adventurers are just kind of like hanging out beneath this tree, but there is something sinister watching from the shadows. Very, very cool. And I think very evocative for this type of setting. The book goes on to give a little bit more information about how to incorporate backgrounds into the setting. And it does something a little bit different in that it breaks down the backgrounds by class. And I think this is really cool and makes it much more likely that you're going to get a background that kind of matches up to what you would expect as a background for that class. And of course, if you're not happy with rolling on a random chart, I'm sure you're always welcome to just pick a background that you think best suits your character. Next, the book goes on to talk a little bit about naming conventions. And I actually think this is really important for a campaign setting. Personally, I really like to have worlds that have fairly fleshed out cultures that do feel very different from one another in a way that feels like natural. And I think that's like doubly important when you are running in a human-centric campaign setting where you can't always easily tell just based on aesthetics what kind of creature or faction that you might be dealing with. And of course, this does draw plenty of inspiration from various real-world cultures, which while I know some people don't like that as much, I personally find it very helpful just so that I can have a shorthand for how to portray that culture in the world. And just in general, I think that names are really important. And I think that a well-formulated, apt name can go a long way towards helping players to understand the world without having to do a huge expositional dump on a regular basis. And as you can see, there are a ton of different factions here, as well as male and female names for each faction. There are also some additional gear options, which I'm not going to spend too much time talking about, as well as the various different spell lists that I referenced earlier. And of course, several new spells, some of which are relatively light reskins of existing options, while some of which are completely new. Next, the book goes on to talk a little bit about alignment and religion in the setting. And I have to say that I really do like the alignment rules in this setting. Instead of using the traditional law and chaos, the alignments are broken down into light and shadow. And this is not really just like a discrete, like you are this thing or you are that thing. It really is more of a sliding scale. And as you perform good or bad actions, your alignment will shift towards one side or the other. You know, for me, this is very reminiscent of like the KOTOR Knights of the Old Republic style of alignment, where you slide back and forth between gradients of the light side and the dark side. And the author's framing of this as almost like a spiritual hit points, you know, really resonated with me personally. And as soon as I read that phrase, I immediately knew what the system was going to be and that I would probably like it quite a bit. As a matter of fact, I like it so much that I'm probably just going to steal this for my own personal games. And I think I may have mentioned it earlier, but the author does include a modified version of the Shadowdark character sheet that replaces the standard alignment section, so you can keep track of where you are on that track between light and shadow. Oh, and I did forget to mention explicitly that if your character ever gets to maximum shadow, the game says that they become so corrupted by darkness and so consumed by madness and despair that they are no longer usable as player characters. Although I imagine they may show up like kind of later in the campaign, perhaps as some sort of antagonist, which I think is very cool and very thematic for this type of setting. There are also what looks like maybe supplements to the carousing system from the core Shadowdark rules. So basically some additional rules for, you know, instead of carousing, doing good works, tithing, and prayer, which again, I think is very thematic to the setting. The book then goes on to talk a little bit about religion in the setting, and it has a lot of shades of our own historical world, which again is something I appreciate because it makes the barrier to entry to a setting like this a lot lower than something that's been, you know, completely fabricated out of whole cloth. I'm not going to spend a ton of time dwelling on the religions in the setting, so definitely feel free to pause if you'd like to see more in-depth information about the various different religions. But overall, I will just say that I really do like this pantheon, and I think it's very fitting for the setting. And in fact, in many ways, I do actually like this more than the kind of default pantheon that we do see in the core Shadowdark rules. But it comes at the cost of, you know, having to go through a lot more information about religion and the gods than what you would see in core Shadowdark. There's also some pretty extensive information on the languages that are involved in the setting. One thing of note is that it is not assumed that your character necessarily knows how to read and write even their own core language. And the author goes into quite a bit of detail about all the various different languages spoken by the various different factions throughout the world. Again, I'm not going to spend a ton of time talking about those languages, but my overall take is that this is a very well thought out world, you know, with a lot of detail added to give you some additional flavor if you are interested in engaging with the language portion of this type of game. Personally, my own kind of engagement with languages in tabletop RPGs is relatively minor, but it can be a nice way to throw a particular player a bone and to help them feel, you know, more special or involved, you know, in a particular location or setting. There's also some additional information about how to handle currency in the setting. Managing different type of currencies really isn't something that I do personally in my own games. I'm personally more than happy to use just like a silver or gold base and not worry about any other types of coin. But for those of you who want a little bit more detail on the currency for the setting, it is available on this 2-page spread. Next, the book goes into a fairly lengthy explanation of the various different ancestries, factions, and locations associated with the setting. really kind of focusing and breaking them down by the different ancestry. So pretty extensive section on the race of men and their various different realms and kingdoms, taking into account a wide variety of cultures. They kind of use real world analogs as the basis for their design. And I think most of these are going to be fairly obvious to people who have a pretty good grasp on history for this time period. But I wouldn't have been upset to see like a little bit of flavor text at the very beginning of each culture, just kind of giving me a very explicit cultural touchstone for that faction. And in some cases, I think it does do this. But again, I would not have minded seeing it be more frequent and explicit, just so that I have a very quick shorthand ahead of time, so I can read through the rest of the description with the framing of the culture that it was intended to evoke. And again, I know not everybody would be a big fan of that, but I think that would personally help me out quite a bit. So I am going to be scrolling through and skipping through lots of the sections of the book. Obviously, if you want to see the whole thing, definitely go check out the link down in the video description. Again, another piece of gorgeous black and white artwork here. Again, very evocative of the setting. But despite the fact this is a relatively human-centric setting, there is still plenty of information about the non-human factions as well. So we've got plenty of information about the various different factions of elves, as well as the dwarves, the halflings, and the gnomes, which kind of make up the quote-unquote good factions. Although the author does mention earlier in the book that even though these various different factions are willing to work together, at least on some occasions, they are usually going to be fairly uneasy allies. And it isn't necessarily a guarantee that your human character is going to receive a warm welcome in some of these other areas of the world. There's also plenty of information about the various different antagonistic factions in the world. We've got examples of orcs here, as well as what the book calls ballspawn, which are a collection of various different, traditionally evil factions, which includes goblinoids, giants, and taurens, which are kind of like the beastmen. Again, an absolute ton of information here. We're literally talking like dozens and dozens of pages about background information for the various different factions and ancestries in the setting. One thing that I did want to call out that I really liked was that there is a pretty heavy emphasis on knightly factions in the setting. And one of the cooler orders makes their headquarters at a place called Temple Bridge, which in my opinion is probably one of the cooler locations in the setting. And again, I think it's just very cool, the idea that this world has been played in for so long, and that a lot of these various characters either are or have ties to some of the previous player characters that have adventured in the setting in the past. And again, there are just pages upon pages of information on the various different NPCs and antagonists the characters might meet during their journeys in Formoria. And here you can see a depiction of one of the setting's main antagonists, which is Zodakar, the Lich King of Vodmore. And of course, what setting isn't complete if there isn't some sort of Lich or Lich adjacent character that's kind of pulling the strings behind the scenes. Very, very cool. Looks like this is a great piece of art for that villain. There are also several pages of the various different magical items that are kind of inherent to the setting. I will say I just glanced through these very briefly. They do look very cool. I think it would be my preference though if they more closely adhere to the formatting that's used for magical items in the core Shadowdark rules. They don't necessarily have to be that concise, but I do particularly like the formatting of those items. And these are really more just kind of like a wall of text, which can be a lot harder to parse if you're just reading through casually. As I mentioned earlier, there's also a pretty extensive bestiary for the setting. And there's a pretty lengthy section of the bestiary that's dedicated to animal lords, which are described as enormous ancient animal spirits. So I'm very much getting like Princess Mononoke vibes from this section. And we finally get the Shadowdark version of the Banshee, which is conspicuously absent from the Shadowdark core rules and really dialed up all the way to 11 in terms of power. This is a level 8 undead creature with a very, very nasty whale attack that is designed to drain a character's charisma and will cause death if they ever manage to reach 0. So I always love to see a good Banshee in my games. But I did compare a couple of them to some of the offerings in the core rulebook, and I have to say, for the most part, these creatures do look fairly balanced against their core rule counterparts. I know that Shadowdark is a game that doesn't necessarily concern itself with balance, but for me personally, I really do appreciate when authors take the time to go through and make sure that the power level of the various different creatures and character options that they offer is in line with the core design philosophy and principles of the core Shadowdark game. And like I said, for the most part, I think Formoria meets that goal. All right, so one thing I did want to talk about that I'm not necessarily a huge fan of, there are several instances in this book where it will start like a new section at the end of a page. And maybe we'll just include like maybe just the header or the header and some flavor text, but the rest of the relevant information is either on the next page or, like in worst case scenario, is on the next 2-page spread. And you can see a couple of different examples of that here on the page I've got up right now. And here, especially with the Canite Shaman down here in the bottom right, you can see once again, this is an example of where the title and the flavor text are on one page, but the actual stats are on the next 2-page spread. Now, is this the end of the world? No, probably not. But I think that like best practices in an ideal scenario, you do want to keep all the relevant information for a particular section, either on a particular page, wherever you can, or at the very least on one 2-page spread. But again, like I said, not the end of the world. Then after the Bestiary, the book spends many, many pages on random encounter tables for the various different regions of Formoria. And I have to say, overall, I do really like the way that these are laid out, you know, with all of the flavor information on the left page and the random encounter tables on the right page. And I like the random encounter tables in particular for a couple of different reasons. The first is that they are fairly beefy. You are going to get a lot of variety in any given region of this world. I also really like the fact that they're split into a day and night section, with the nighttime encounters generally being much more dangerous than their daytime equivalents. And I also really like some of the variety even within individual entries. So for example, right now we're looking at the Wild Wood at the nighttime. On a 5, there are 3d6 wolves, 10% of which are dire wolves. And then if we go lower down on the page to a 22, one of those encounters is D4 ogres, 2d4 bugbears, and 2d6 goblins. But what I really like about these is that they add a little bit more variety to each of the encounters. I do want at least 1 or 2 different variations within each group of monsters. Now, this is not a universal rule, but when it makes sense, I do like to employ this kind of variety. I think it just adds a little bit more tactical depth to the combats with those encounters. So overall, again, just a pretty big fan of these random encounter tables. Next, we've got a pretty lengthy, I think it's like about 13 pages of history for this campaign setting. So definitely a ton of information to dig into if you do want to learn more about what's happened in this region's past. Now, I have to say personally, 13 pages of lore for a setting is probably bordering on just about as much information as I could possibly want about a setting. But given how like kind of deep and rich the setting is, I don't think that 13 pages is an unreasonable amount of fluff or background. But it is definitely something to be aware of if you are expecting this to be something that's more similar in size and scope to, let's say, like the Cursed Scrolls zines from the official Shadowdark line. This is very much not that. This is a much larger, much better fleshed out world. Now, I imagine that there are some of you who are not going to like that as much, but I definitely think there's going to be some people out there that really enjoy the depth and detail that is offered in this campaign setting. I also do want to point out that the setting does come with its very own character sheet. As you can see, very similar to the baseline Shadowdark sheet, but there is a replacement here for the alignment section so that you can very easily track this setting's version of alignment. And I had to say, this really does feel like kind of an above and beyond feature, and I'm really happy to see it included here. Now, if we can just convince the folks that are working on the Foundry VTT implementation for Shadowdark to incorporate this into their design, that would just be fantastic. So finally, here at the very end, we do have a level 1 adventure that serves kind of as an introduction to the setting. I'm not going to go into too much detail on this. I don't really want to spoil anything, but I will say that overall, I do really like this adventure. While it is like fairly short and simple, I think this is actually the perfect length for a level 1 starter adventure. And I will say that if I was a player running through this adventure, I think that it would immediately have me hooked into the setting. And I think in particular, it does a really good job of acting as an introduction to Formoria and does a good job of kind of anchoring players in the general time period in which the setting is supposed to occur. So I did just want to take a second to talk about the various different maps that come with the setting. As you can see, there is quite a bit of variety here. You've got maps for the overall world, for the actual region of Formoria. You've got maps for the various different major settlements. And you even have a dungeon map for the first level introductory adventure. And even within that, there's like a ton of different varieties. So you've got usually like a black and white version, you've got color versions. For some of the major overland area, you have versions with hexes and without. You've also like got a map of the overall region by difficulty or danger level, which I think is very, very cool. And you've also got like more of like a political style map as well, so that you can see all the various different political factions that are at work in the setting. So overall, super happy with the maps that are included in this setting. Now, I did just want to point out that originally these maps were being sold as a separate purchase on DriveThruRPG, but I just got done talking to Bryan, the author of this setting, and after a little bit of deliberation, he has decided to make these separate image files available as part of the core setting PDF, which personally I think is definitely the correct call. Okay, so what are my overall thoughts on Formoria, the Dark Age? Well, overall, I think this is a really great campaign setting and very much in line with my own personal tastes. And there are also a couple of issues that I do want to spend a little bit of time talking about. But first, I want to go over the things that I really liked about Formoria. And I think first and foremost, I just have to say that I absolutely love this setting. I am a huge fan of human-centric points of light settings, especially those that are kind of like historical fantasy adjacent. Not necessarily those that take place in our actual real world, but those that have very strong echoes of our own past, as well as our legends and myths. But it also does a good job of making the setting feel like its own thing. It also feels incredibly well fleshed out, which makes a lot of sense considering that the author has been playing in the setting for almost 30 years at this point. As I mentioned earlier, the world very much feels like alive and lived in a way that you don't often get with these types of campaign settings. I also really enjoy the various different character options, especially the new classes. For the most part, they're just like kind of minor tweaks on existing options. I think in several cases, I actually like these new versions of the classes more than I do the originals. I also really love the alignment system in this setting. I've always really liked the idea of alignment in D&D in general, but I've never been really satisfied with the implementation of alignment. And I think Formoria does a really good job at solving that, basically managing to be everything that I really need out of an alignment system while still being very concise and easy to understand. In particular, I really like the framing of alignment as spiritual hit points. For whatever reason, that really resonated with me and helped me really understand what the system was about, with just that very simple phrase. And I imagine this is not going to be everyone's cup of tea, especially those who might favor playing more evil or dark side characters. But for me, the alignment system was a huge hit, and I do actually plan on stealing this for my own personal home games. Finally, I really like the starter adventure for all the reasons that I mentioned in that section. Basically, I think it just acts as a really good introduction to this world and doesn't overstay its welcome. So let's talk a little bit about the things that I didn't like as much. As I mentioned, I did find some issues with the formatting or layout of the book. I think that initial black and white map of Formoria at the very beginning of the book being a really good example. Now, I did reach out to the author after doing an outline for this video, and he did tell me that he is aware of the issue and he's looking at some possible fixes, but the core of the issue seems to be a difference between the print and PDF version of the book, but he is looking into how to fix it. And I do think that that's really important because I do have to admit when I first opened the PDF, and this was kind of like the first thing I saw, it immediately kind of put me in like a more critical mindset than I probably otherwise would have been in going into this setting. And kind of as I mentioned earlier, there are several places in the book where all of the relevant information needed for a particular section are not included either on the same page or at the very least on the same 2-page spread. So the example I used earlier was this Canite Shaman, where the title and flavor text are on one 2-page spread, but the actual stat line for that creature isn't available until the next 2-page spread. Again, not necessarily a huge issue, but I do think it would look better and also improve readability if all the information that you needed for a particular topic, was either on one page, ideally, or worst case scenario on a single 2-page spread. And this is kind of the point in the video where I would have talked about, probably my biggest issue with Formoria as a campaign setting. And that would be that the original price point for the setting was actually $29 US, not including the additional map pack that you would need to get the separate image files for the various maps that you would need to run the setting. But as I alluded to earlier, I did reach out to the author after writing up the outline for this video. And I provided him a list of things that, both the things that I liked about the setting, as well as some things that I didn't like. When I mentioned the price point, he said that he had also been kind of pondering this himself. And he agreed that it might be set a little bit too high, especially in comparison to other similar products. So it looks like he has actually already gone in and marked this down from $29 US to $19 US. He also let me know that he was going to roll the maps that were originally only available as a separate purchase into the main purchase for the core campaign setting. And I just got an email from DriveThruRPG, so that does already seem to have been put into place. And with those changes, that really does kind of eliminate my largest critique of the setting and makes it much easier for me to recommend this product to the folks watching this channel. Now, of course, you're still going to have to decide for yourself whether or not you think this is a good price point for the product, but I personally would be a lot more comfortable paying $19 for this setting than I would be $29. And again, I think this brings it much more in line with other kind of similar offerings on DriveThruRPG. So kind of with that said, I found Formoria to be a really awesome setting, and I can definitely tell this was very much a labor of love. And definitely very much up my alley in terms of campaign settings. And especially now with the recent price decrease, I imagine that there are more than a few of you out there who are going to be very eager to pick this up for yourself. As a reminder, there is a link down in the video description where you can pick up a copy for yourself if you are so inclined. Also, if you enjoyed this video, please consider checking out my other Shadowdark reviews, which should be popping up on your screen right about now. And also let me know what you think about Formoria the Dark Age down in the comment section of this video. The only thing that I ask is that if you do offer criticism, please do so in a constructive and respectful way. But to be honest, we haven't really had much of a problem with that on this channel so far. So I hope that that continues to be the ongoing trend. But I think that's about it for now. Thank you so much for watching and have a wonderful day. Bye.